So hopefully everybody's in the right room, right? Point of sale breach investigation. Yeah, anybody not? All right, so the title's a little bit misleading. The whole point of this is actually to kind of show you guys investigation techniques and things that you should be looking at on systems. These are just common ones that I've observed myself when working some of them. So just to introduce myself, my name is Kevin Strickland. I'm one of the senior incident response consultants with Dell SecureWorks, well, just SecureWorks now. I work on pretty much anything you can think of, from large data breaches to website compromises to ransomware cases, anything of that nature. Before I worked for SecureWorks, I actually worked for the Department of Defense doing intrusion analysis, incident handling, reverse engineering malware, and digital forensics. So the reason why I created this presentation, I guess, was because I noticed that we got a lot of interns and college graduates and law enforcement guys that just couldn't do the IR function, right? They would take a week to find stuff that some of the more experienced guys would find in an hour, right? And so my question was, why is it taking you guys so long to find it, right? For us, it's always, clients are demanding answers, they want it now, and we need to go figure it out, right? Because the longer it takes us to figure it out, the more damage is happening to the customer, right? And that's what we need to figure out. So I have a laser pointer. So there's a lot of different types of point of sale malware, right? And I'm just going to call it POS. It's not the other POS that you might be thinking of, so just remember that. There's a lot. These are just a list of a couple of them. Some of the most popular ones are Framework POS, Raw POS, Black POS. There's a couple of different ones as well. There's new variants that are coming out all the time. And it's not just isolated to these types of malware variants, right? Anyone know what NetWire or Adwind is? Or care to guess? No? No one wants to guess? Always Google too. Google's your best friend. But Adwind and NetWire are types of remote access tools, right? So what we've seen in the past year is that hotel chains are getting infected, right? So they get an email that basically says, hey, I have a reservation. They open it up. It's actually a malicious executable or a malicious Java file known as a jar or a Java archive. And those are actually rats. And the rats have key logging functionality built into them. So when you go to the hotel and you swipe your card, or they take the card and they swipe it for you, right? That data gets sent over to the computer, all in clear text, right? And because it's clear text, the keylogger sees it and saves it to a file, so now your credit card credentials have been stolen, or your card data has been stolen. So that's one specific way. For today, we'll probably concentrate more on the actual point of sale malware itself and sort of the way that it works. So again, you go to a retail store, you go to Target, Home Depot, Walmart, etc., what have you, doesn't matter, right? You go and swipe your card, that card total gets sent from the pin pad over to the computer. Now that's sort of where the transaction occurs, and sometimes we don't have encryption that takes place, right? So sometimes you might hear point-to-point encryption, right? So that would be from the pin pad to the computer itself, and it'd be all encrypted. Well, that doesn't really happen as much as retailers like to think that it does, right? So a lot of times it happens to be in clear text. So while the point of sale malware is actively running on this system, it looks into specific processes, right? There's some processes that aren't going to hold card data, so the malware doesn't need to go scan them, right? Processes like SVC host, probably Word, right? Notepad, those things probably are not holding credit card data, right? There's actual Opera is an example of point of sale software, right, that would store that type of information. So malware authors do this so they help make it less likely that they're going to crash the system. All right. So another issue that we see, and I'll probably talk on this a little bit more later, so I might jump around, is that card data that the malware steals, they don't often just put it on the system as card data, right? They encode it, right? So some things I see a lot of the new folks that we get is they do keyword searches or regex expressions for credit card data or card information, right? They're not going to get results a lot of the time, or the results that they're looking for, because it's been encoded, and we'll talk more about that later. And of course, once they kind of get that card data, they have to exfiltrate outside of the environment. And there's two different types. There's the manual exfiltration method, right, where there's a manual intrusion in the environment. The attacker will collect those output files that were stored by the malware and then bring them to a central machine and send it out. You also have the other type of point of sale malware that will actually, once it encodes it on the system, it'll send it outside from that specific system. Depends a lot on the environment that you're investigating. So before we kind of get into some of the investigative techniques, just to talk about some of the way that the chains are set up. These are rudimentary designs. These aren't exactly what they look like, so please forgive me. They're just the best that I can make up without spending a lot of hours on it. So this is a basic retail network, right? So we have the different stores. In those different stores, you have your point of sale terminals, right? Again, you go to the cash register, you swipe your card, right? Kohl's, Walmart, etc. This is kind of how it's set up right here. When that data gets processed, it gets sent over to the WAN or to a central location where it then gets processed and sent out to sometimes headquarters or sometimes to the merchant or the processor, right? Some of the processors are like First Data, Elevon. Those are the companies that actually process the card information themselves before it's sent further along the lines. This is something that you would see at a mom and pop shop, something also like Subway, right? Some of the smaller stores. Sorry, I keep working in front of you. You would probably just see a couple of computers in the back of a house server, and then a modem that sends the data out to the internet. This is also very common in your hotel chains, right? They're more like franchises, like Hampton Inns, Holiday Inns, things of that nature, right? They have like 2 front desk computers, they have a manager PC, and they have a back of a house server where all the cards get sent to, sometimes in bulk, and it's sent out to the internet. We'll just call it the internet for now. Right, so when we deal with the point of sale investigation, right, sometimes what happens is the card brands will force merchants to do it or retailers to do it, right? It's called a PFI investigation or a professional forensics investigation. I don't want to argue about it. We can talk about it later. So what happens when you're a merchant or a retailer and you say, hey, I want to process Visa, I want to process MasterCard, right? They sign a contract with those card brands that basically says if they get breached or there's evidence of fraud that warrants an investigation, that retailer has to pay for it, right? So then that's when they'll do the actual investigation itself. And so what we ask for is what we call a CPP, or a common point of purchase, right? So the card brands like Visa, Discover, and all them will have their fraud teams. And they basically say, look, the last place these cards were used before fraud was reported was at your location. So there's some compromise at your location or something happening there that we think is the cause of this. So that's the CPP. The CPP also provides dates. The dates are pretty iffy, right? We've worked lots of cases where it's happened in November. We come out, they've been compromised for 2 years, right? So timelining is very difficult when we get CPPs because, you know, my experience is 50-50. They might be right. Most of the time they're completely wrong. They've just been compromised for a long time and it took their fraud department a pretty long time to figure it out. So again, kind of taking, when we go on site or you ask for stuff from them, you want forensic images, logs, right? We're not going to get into all the things that you're going to ask from them, but those are some of the basic ones. One thing I'll mention as we get into this is, you know, we ask a lot of questions about how the network is set up, right? As you should if you're investigating, you know, what kind of firewall logs do you have, how is their network segmentation, things of that nature. Take that with a grain of salt. A lot of times it's wrong, right? It's you know, can you get from A to B? No. Well, yeah, the attacker did it, that you got from A to B, right? So when someone says, hey, that's not possible, it's probably possible. They just haven't, you know, we haven't figured it out yet, or someone else figured it out for us. So again, when we get some of those new folks in and we kind of train to get them up to speed, my goal is to, if we give you forensic images and there's a pretty good indicator that they've been compromised or some sort of point of sale malware is on there, to find it within a couple of hours, right? If it takes you longer than a day to find it, then there might not be anything there, or we're just not looking in the right place. So that's kind of like the goal of the investigation. So this is sort of a very small investigation plan on what you're going to be doing. So of course you have your pre-processing, your timelining, your artifact extraction and parsing, keyword searching, and Yara rules. Anyone familiar with Yara? No? Yara is the big one. All right. So Yara is basically rules that you can create to scan files on a system that match certain patterns. So if I know there's point of sale malware out there and it has the specific data inside of it, I can create rules to go scan other systems looking for it. Right? Kind of makes sense. So I know if the malware always says malware in the file, right? I can use a Yara rule to go scan everything on the system that has Yara within that file. It's mostly beneficial for looking at DLLs, EXEs, right? Binaries and things of that nature. Not so much Word documents or PDFs. I personally like to use the tool Loki. It's free. You can just go download it. You can use Yara rules with it. You can also use indicators of compromise rules as well. So it's pretty nice. And you can run that against images, directories, files, things of that nature. So right now we're going to try to jump into what I call, it's really sniper forensics, if you will. Again, the timelining, we have folks that kind of argue this back and forth is look at the system from a timeline perspective, but if you don't know the timeline, right, well, what am I going to look at? Right? How am I going to find badness on a computer? Right? And so that's what we call sniper forensics. We can look at certain artifacts to find badness. It's sort of like the 80% of your findings are from like 20% of the files or something like that. So that's kind of how I put it out there. So one of the first things that I like to look at is program execution. And there's a lot of different artifacts for program execution, and it's also very dependent on the operating system itself, right? Windows XP has less evidence than Windows 10 does, right? Microsoft doesn't build it that way. They actually have more evidence on Windows 10 because of the user experience that they designed and as they progress throughout the operating systems. So here's just a couple. This isn't just a specific list. You have your Prefetch, your user assist, your application compatibility cache, also known as the shim cache, and the recent file cache, the AM cache, event logs, and there's a lot more. Can anyone think of any other places to look on a Windows system for program execution? You in the blue shirt. Yep, good point. So by default, Windows does not log process creation. So you can enable that in the Windows security event logs. You can also enable command line auditing as well, which will give you the full command pass to the process. Again, none of this is enabled by default. A good point. Any other ideas? How many people are students in here? Okay, how many are people, students from Bloomsburg? How many are from another school? How many like professionals are in here? So like your job is like consulting or like forensics, incident response, malware analysis? No? So what do you guys do? Like what's your, just give me an idea of.
Just basic response, like React.
Okay. All right, so the reason why I asked that is, I want to make this casual. If you have questions, ask questions, right? I'm going to go through some things. I might go through them pretty fast because I want to get to the end where there's a exercise where you guys will actually have to try to figure out the point of sale breach itself, right? Remember, I'm talking about this from a point of sale view, but this applies to any investigation that you could do, right? And the goal is to find badness as quick as possible. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so alternate data streams were originally designed in Windows XP for cooperation, I guess, with HFS file systems or the Mac file systems, right? So attackers like to use ADS a lot because Windows XP natively couldn't see them, right? So on Windows Vista and up, they got rid of that, and so you can actually see alternate data streams now natively. So if you ever go to your computer, open a command prompt, and type dir /r, that'll show you alternate data streams, right? Anyone knows what Windows uses them for now? Yep, geo-tracking. To talk about that for people that probably are, if you want something that's probably more common, if you download a Word document from the internet, anyone ever get that thing that says this originated from the internet? Do you know how Windows knows that? From an alternate data stream. There's an alternate data stream called a zone identifier, and if it originates from the internet, it's actually a number 3 within that file, and that's when you get that prompt that says, are you sure you want to open this originated from the internet? That actually comes from an alternate data stream, but thanks for bringing that up. Anything else? There's another one that we'll get to that probably people aren't really familiar with. So one of the best ones that I recommend to look at when I first start is the shim cache, right? It's a registry entry. It contains a lot of different data in it. But what are we looking for? What is bad in here? I've had some where there's 800 lines, 1,000, 100. Sometimes I've had it was not even there, which is incredibly unfortunate, but that's okay. So just kind of, ideas of what to look for is file names that don't belong or are in the wrong directory, right? Where does SVC host belong? Anyone care to guess? No? Does anyone know what SVC host is? Service host, what's it responsible for? Tons of things, right? So SVC host is responsible for tons of things. It's mainly responsible for running services like printer spooler, a couple of background jobs like bits, and a couple of other things as well, right? So that belongs in System 32. If we don't see it in there, like someone's user profile, that might be odd, right? That's something that we'd want to look into. Also executables within like the program data folder, right? Which is Windows Vista and up. Also things that are like random 8 characters, 10 characters, 3 characters, 1.exe. That's weird, right? Sometimes the attacker's a little bit more sophisticated. For this, we're going to kind of keep it a little level, but they'll actually go in and mimic other executables within the environment and just move it into a different directory. So something to keep into account. So what I did here is I actually created a list from an actual point of sale breach, and I shrunk it a lot to make it a little bit easier. So I know we all have different experiences in the room, but is there anyone that wants to give a guess to how many bad executables are in here? Or like, which one's bad, I guess, if you can see it. Yeah, you can see it. Shout it out. It's not going to bother. There's no wrong answers. Go ahead.
I don't know why is Patch Sweeper and install that bad. And
So hash sweeper 64 and install.bat, right? So those are pretty odd. I don't know what they are. Hash sweeper's fine. Install.bat's a good find. But why did you pick install.bat?
Because install.bat is not supposed to be. First of all, install.bat. I don't remember any modern Windows using anything other than MSI or exe for installers. And even then, for Windows, it's either MSI or cab files.
Yeah, very possible. That's good. Well,
Not seen install.bat since the DOS days.
yeah, so that's actually going back to like Windows DOS. That's true. So good answer. You in the back?
The S isn't capitalized, so the Windows/system32/MSI.exe.
So,
It's not the normal system 32.
so it's not, but that also has to do with the parser that's being used, right? But that would be something that might throw you off. But we'll take that. Case sensitivity doesn't really matter. The parsers kind of change that based on like Unicode ASCII representations and a couple other things. I think you had the same thing. Does anyone else have like any other patterns that they might see they think are odd? Ma'am?
But you have an external drive with D.
Yep. So that's a good answer. So the D drive is perfectly fine here. It's actually like the data drive for this particular system, right? But that would be something that you'd want to look at. Anyone notice anything else that's weird? PS exec. So what's PS exec? Right, so PS exec is a Windows System Internals tool that allows you to basically connect to other machines and run processes. It allows you to do a lot more, right? So that's a bit odd. It's not that odd because system administrators use it, so it's hard to say, is that really like a bad threat actor, or is that the IT administrators doing something to the system? Oh, went too far. So there's also another strange pattern here that's kind of hard to pick out, but there's 4 files here that all have the same exact date. So let me talk to you about this date. So in the shim cache, there's a date entry associated with the executable. That date on Windows Vista and above is the modified date of the file. It's not the date that it executed. All right, that's very important. Windows XP, it is the date it executed. Right, that's the only difference. So the operating system plays a big part here. So these stand out because they're all the same exact date. And that's a little bit odd to me. Like, why are they all the same exact date? Right? Anyone care to guess what could be going on?
Probably all put there at the same time.
They could have all been put there at the same time. The computer wasn't created in 2003. I'll tell you that. So that's a good point, though. Oh, you over there.
The files were originally created and moved on, and they were put on the system.
That's possible. It's possible. In this case, that's not true, but there are cases where that could be. And then I think, ma'am, no. So, what was that? Log manipulation. So, so I skipped over this again because I'm trying to get to the exercise because I was running a little bit behind. These are based in a registry entry that could be modified. It's unlikely, but that is a possibility. So, what's really happening here, based on some of my experience, is that the attacker actually time stamps the files, right? So when I go through some of the shim cache articles and I look for patterns that might stand out to me, this is a pattern that I look for, is files with a lot of the same modified timestamps. It's not something that happens very, very often, right? So that's something that I look for. So here, I found 4 files that have the same modified date from 2003. In this particular case, when I was looking at the forensic image, they didn't even exist. That's also another red flag. Why did they exist at one point, and now they don't exist, right? And just to mention, install.bat, well, that's a bit odd. Why is it in System 32, right? Most system admins aren't going to create batch scripts and put them in System 32, in my experience. Again, if there's any system admins in here, feel free to debate after. I'm sure we have. So there's also other ways to sort of find badness with a shim cache. So I always recommend keep that intelligence with you, document these things, keep a repository of the shim cache. So one of the things that we ended up doing is we collected a lot of shim cache entries from a couple of investigations. So I took all of those shim cache entries, right, which was about 53,000, and I filtered them down to see what I would find odd in Windows System 32. System 32 is relatively static, right? It should be the same throughout most environments, give or take, right? So if I can, find something that doesn't fit 10,000 other systems, maybe there's an odd irregularity here, right? So I did that. So I took my first engagement and it brought it down to 580 entries for me to review. Well, that's still a lot to review, right? So why don't I take this 580 entries and I compare them to the 300 entries I found for engagement 1 and filtered them down to the ones that were unknown. And that's what I did right here. So I just compared the two and said, tell me the ones that aren't in this first list that are in the second list. And so I got these entries here. Each one of these entries are bad. They're all related to raw POS, which is a type of malware family, right? So I could have searched and looked through the whole entire shim cache to find something odd, but instead I wanted to try to see if I could do some sort of analytical exercise to find it a little bit faster. So I did that here. So I did a second engagement. I did the same exact thing, right? This happened a couple months later. Once again, I found some badness, right? Things that didn't belong, right? So REMCOM. And just to touch on this real quick, because we said a PS exec, let me go back to, this is an important note. So PS exec, there's a really important part about PS exec. So remember how I mentioned that these timestamps are the modified times, right? Well, PS exec is special. So when PS exec, you use PS exec to remote into another computer or destination system, it'll create the PS exec service, which is PSExec.exe. Sorry, I'm going to look it up here. It's PSEXE.svc.exe, right? That actual timestamp is the time it actually ran on the endpoint. That's one of the only cases where it happens like that. So you can use that as part of your timeline analysis. And framepackage.exe is actually a custom version of PSExec that the threat actors made. All right. So moving on to Prefetch. Prefetch is probably one of the most useless ones in my opinion, but it's something that a lot of folks come in and start looking at. But there's actually a lot more to Prefetch than people actually look into. So normally you kind of get this. It tells you the last time it was ran, the first time it was ran, and how many times it was ran. But one thing to keep in mind when Prefetch actually occurs, right? Does anyone know what prefetching is before I kind of get too far into that? So Prefetch is a Windows operating system process. So when you execute programs constantly, Windows said, hey, let us build a way so that those programs can launch faster, and that's what Prefetch is. So when you launch Word, for example, right, Windows takes into account within the first 10 seconds all the files that Word needs, right, all the DLLs, the dynamic link libraries, and it stores them in a .pf or a Prefetch file, right? So that helps us with malware too. So when we're actually analyzing the Prefetch files, don't just look at these timestamps that says when it ran and where it ran from, but I actually need to parse it out and find out what were the files called by that process, right? So you can see here, command.exe, I don't have the laser pointer, executed. Here's the files that were involved in that execution, and one of the files is ncsvr32.exe. Right? So I went and found that file. It's part of the raw point-of-sale malware family. Right? So that's just another thing. If I had just looked at this data on the left, which a lot of folks do, I wouldn't have seen this, and that's a very important threat indicator that I have to do some of my searches on. Right? So remember that. The next one is Amcache. Amcache is in Windows 7 now, Windows 8, Windows 10, and above. So Amcache is awesome because it gives a lot of data. One of the most significant items that it gives us is the last modified time of the file, the creation time, and the SHA-1 hash of the file, right? So the hash is significant because if it's on an online source like VirusTotal, I can probably go download it if I have a private account. So for example, in this particular case, T1.exe, which is a bit odd, and systray.exe were also a little bit odd in these locations. We were able to get the hash. We found them on VirusTotal. We were able to download them and do analysis on them, even though they no longer existed on the system. Right? Very beneficial for us and for whoever does the analysis. So I'm going to talk, a lot of these are Windows tools, but if you ever want like the Linux counterparts, just talk to me afterwards. Just most folks are Windows based. This is another sysinternal tool called autoruns. Does anyone know what autoruns are when we refer to forensics? Pretty much, yeah. So autoruns in the generalist terms means that these are the programs that are going to execute when I log on or turn the computer on. Right? So malware, wanting to remain on the system, will create these auto-run or persistence mechanisms so that they keep starting over and over again, even if the computer's restarted. So one of the cool things that people don't realize about auto runs when you're doing like forensic analysis, if you just want to have a nice graphical interface, you can actually point it to a mounted disk image and then load it. So it's a little easier to go through. This one always gets people, I'll just put it up here, is the gather network info. That always flags on most Windows computers, but that's actually a home group VBS script. It's not bad, but something to keep in mind. So other things to look for as far as persistent mechanisms are services, right? We talked about services a little bit, but the nice thing is services are recorded in the registry. They're also recorded in the system event log, right? So system.evtx. Let me actually skip forward a slide. I think it'll help out. So what you want to look for, when you're doing like your sniper forensics, well, for me, point of sale breaches is almost everyone I've worked, at some point, a service is created, right? So who can create services? Administrators and above, right? So that means administrator access is available, right? It also grants to that process the highest privileges on the system, right? So very significant for card stealing malware as well. So here's an example from another piece of malware family where it's a service called the Serial Port Synchronization Monitor. It's a little bit odd. Again, what I'd look for to see that's being started is a 7045 event, right? One of the first things I go for is to look for that. If I see a service being started, that might be malicious. There's not a lot of times on a system where services are being created, like past the initial install date. Sometimes you have updates from the system admins, a couple things like that, but not all the time. So if you were looking into an environment and you said, hey, let me get all these logs and look at all the services being created, and 100 computers have a service created on the same day, that might be a trigger, right? The other cool, nice thing about this is POS exec, which is a service, will also create this event, something that you want to look into. So if any of you are like in charge or have a SIM or kind of help lead the SOC at any of your organizations, make sure that event sends a trigger somewhere, an email or what have you. I don't know how well you guys can see this. We'll give it a try. So this is just a real quick example. There is actually a malicious service in here, but would you guys be able to pick it out? I know it might be hard to see. And if you want the slides, just get after me after this, and I'll send them to you Monday. Anybody want to try? We can go one by one. And the point of this is to show you that it's not easy to find a malicious service, right? So when you have, you're working on computers and you're not looking at it from analysis perspective, and you're just saying which one of these services is bad, you're probably not going to find it right off the bat. So
I'm used to seeing it as volume shadow.
Yeah, so one of the items brought up is the volume shadow service, which one is it? Microsoft
Software shadow copy provider.
Oh yeah, the Microsoft Software Shadow Copy Provider is perfectly fine, right? But she was mentioning that she's used to seeing the volume shadow copy, which is a native Microsoft application, but it's actually that in services. No, so the .NET, right? Every Windows system has .NET. This one's a little outdated, but it's perfectly fine. But why do you say that might be bad?
It wasn't so description of something pasted over from the file.
Okay, good point.
I don't remember Mozilla's maintenance service being a service.
Oh, sorry. It is for Firefox. It does make a service for some of their updates. But you could Google that or look at your own system or install Firefox to sort of figure that out. So again, looking into patterns a little bit, things that we look for is odd spellings, things not spelled correctly, odd grammar. There's not a lot here, but there is one that sort of stands out, and I don't have a laser pointer. So the one that stands out to me is Microsoft File Manager Services. Most Windows services are singular. This one's plural, right? So it's a little bit odd. Not to mention that the system that, in this case, that I would be looking at is just a workstation and not a file manager. Why does it have that service installed on it? So I'll pop it up for you. And the description of it is creates, updates, manages, and removes files for applications such as SMIME and SSL. If the service is stopped, certificates will not be created. File manager doesn't seem to me to have anything to do with certificates. Right? A little bit odd, right? Again, what kind of points out to me is it's called services, where the rest are mostly singular. Most Microsoft ones are singular in intents. And then just for, unfortunately, a lot of people still use Windows XP. This is just another example of what you would see on Windows XP. So one of the biggest questions we get is lateral movement, right? How do you find lateral movement? It's one of the most, it's sort of easy to find, but it's hard to find at the same time. It also depends on a lot of the data that you have. So For lateral movement, there's different artifacts, but what we're going to concentrate on here is the security event logs and things to look for in the security event logs. So 4624 events are logons, right? 4624s are account was logged off, and 4672 is special privileges. So special privileges means that they are an administrator on the box. All right, and the types of logons also play a very important role, right? There's multiple types of logons. There's type 2, which is physical, I'm sitting at the keyboard. There's type 3, which is a mapped drive, right? So if you use POS exec, that's actually going to be a type 3 logon, right? Because you're making like a mapped drive over 445 or the NetBIOS ports. And type 10 means remote interactive, which uses RDP port 3389, right? So some of those are the big takeaways there in what you want to look for. And then where they're coming from. If you're looking at some of your own cases, right, and you're looking at the security event logs, and there's logons that occur from outside the environment, like from Russia, that's probably not a good sign. One thing I will mention, like really quickly, I don't know if anyone's in charge of actually configuring the event logs. Please do not, that's a double negative, please log successful logons. If you don't log successful logons, we're not going to be able to tell like where they're moving around from, right? We see a lot of companies that just do brute force, so like failed logons. Most of the time when the attacker's in your environment, they're not going to fail. They already know the password, or if they don't know that one password, they'll use another one that'll work, another username and account. Another thing to look for is actual account escalation. So if an attacker's making a batch script or some of those programs, they'll run those as user A, but they want to use domain admin or domain administrator accounts, which is user B. So that'll create a 4648 event saying that it's being ran as an elevated account. Right, so something else to take into account. So the pictures here basically show you that Regis Anchor is running a program as IT admin 1. Right? Not always malicious, IT admins could do that, but this is a case that you would want to look for as well. We see that a lot on some of the, I went too early. A lot of the cases. So other things that threat actors do is they clear event logs, right? So what does clear an event log do? Yep, it creates a new event, tells you who cleared it, and that the event log was cleared. Another thing that threat actors do is they clear the registry, which is where a lot of the data that we get exists. So we sort of try to figure out a way to, how do we see lateral movement if some of those files are gone? Right? So if we look at a Windows, like a user for user A, we can look at their registry and it'll say, user A created a terminal service access to a remote system, right? There's entries for that. But if they clear those up in the registry, how else can we figure it out? Also, if they cleared the security event log. What are some other places we might be able to look for that? Anyone want to guess?
Maybe a command line history somewhere.
Command line history? So command line history is generally stored in memory, but if you have a memory dump, you may be able to find that. You could turn command line auditing on, but we'll say that doesn't exist either. But good point. There is a recent execution list in the directory, but right, but that might not tell us where they went, right? If we want to know what remote system they went to, that may or may not tell us. Sometimes you get like a run MRU command, which is when you pop up Windows R and the run prompt pops up, and you do like the / computer name, and you try to get to that share. That would be like something else in the registry. But of course, the attacker cleaned that out. So there's also another file that's not really well known. It's called the bcache. Most of the time you see it's bcache22 or bcache24.bmc. It's actually a bitmap file, and Windows stores little fragments of data in here to help load it when they do the remote computer, right? So when they log onto the remote computer, it'll save some of those images into this file. I'm not really sure why. I think it's for speed. But this was a great indicator in a lot of instances that a lot of people just aren't looking at. And what you can see here is it gives us a little bit of information. And this is just a really small snippet. So there's a lot of things going on. You can see a net use command for an IP address, right? The user as well. We also see some tools over here on the right, like RegEx, run tool, a text file called SRV, right? Those are other threat indicators that we can look for across the network to see if they are malicious. So RegEx in this case is actually the way that the attacker was spreading the malware around the environment. So I can see this net use command, and now I have a new IP address to go after. That's another system to go look at if I didn't previously know. And so this file helped us a lot in a couple of incidents because they were clearing out a lot of that data. There should be two files now. One of the tools to look at, the BMC viewer, was really hard to find. I think there's another one, but I don't use it. So this is also another Windows artifact that a lot of people don't look at. It's called OBJECTS.DATA. Does anyone know what it is, or has anyone ever heard of it? No one's heard of it? Heard of it yesterday? They probably talked about it in the class right before this, I hope, for the WMI logging and stuff. So anyway, the OBJECTS.DATA file is a WMI, or Windows Management Instrumentation repository, right? And it's got two different purposes. For us, for forensics, the first purpose is really what we call persistence events, right? And I talked about auto runs. Well, the auto runs tool and a lot of the other forensics tools that you use don't parse this file correctly, so you'll never find that auto run event. So what attackers are doing is they're creating event consumers that basically say when the system uptime is 200 seconds, run this executable, right? And that's stored in the objects.data file, right? So it's another method for creating persistence events that a lot of unfortunate forensics folks are not looking at, right? So remember this when you're doing some of your analysis. Just to kind of give you an interesting story is there's an engagement that we're working on right now, and actually found a very sophisticated nation state tool that we had never seen before. The only reason we caught it is because we have a tool to parse this file. But it just kind of makes you think, because we have, people haven't noticed this file for so long, what else could have been missed? And the second part for it is also used for software metering for SCCM, which is a Windows product, right? So again, part of one of the engagements that we were working on, they cleared the event logs, they cleared their registry, right? We didn't really have an idea of what account was doing what. Fortunately, they had turned on software metering, which is stored into this file. So we created a parser for it, and we were able to pull out a timeline of exactly what the attacker was doing and the commands that they were running and the time that they did it. Right? So just looking at this, you may or may not be able to spot something bad. Anyone see anything like really weird in here? No? So sorry, just checking time. One of the most unusual ones is WCE32, right? That is generally associated with a tool called Windows Credential Editor, right? Which is a tool to harvest credentials from systems, right? So that's like a keyword that we use. Attackers sometimes change names of tools, sometimes they don't. They just don't think they're going to get caught, or just not worried about it. But that's a good giveaway there. Oh. Did I turn this off? No, it's still there. Can you guys still hear me? I feel like I'm yelling. So, and last but not least, because we did our pre-processing, we were using timelining, right? There's different tools to do timelining. Most folks are familiar with Plasso or Log2Timeline. Any X-Ways fans in here? No? No? So I'm a huge X-Ways person, but X-Ways does timelining just like Plasso does, in my opinion. So this is just like a real good example of putting all of that together based on some data that we have. So we have a logon type 3 from this administrator account. We know where they logged in from. Sorry, if you guys can't hear me, let me know, because I feel like it went off. It's an administrator account. As soon as they logged on, they started PS exec. It executed. We also have SC, which is used for services. All of a sudden, a new service is created. Let me go back. Sorry. The service is created here, along with the file. They log off. The service starts. Two new files down here at the bottom are created: spoolsv.chm and then the prefetch file for monsync. So again, to talk about prefetch, a lot of those prefetch files will get pushed out too. So that's why another reason why I don't like, they're not like the best means for finding program execution in a lot of cases. And to sort of roll it up, when you start looking at your different logons or remote logons, right? So you have tools like LogMeIn. What else is there? TeamViewer. Anybody use a Citrix environment? Or familiar with Citrix? Okay. Or VPNs. You can get those logs and you want to look for some abnormalities. So here's a really good example of things that you might want to look for. We have the client name here, which is really in this case the workstation name. And this is why you ask, well, what is the standard naming convention within your environment or the environment that you work in? So in this case, it's pretty easy. Desktop, if it's an admin, it's called admin. Yeah, I renamed these, but desktop, FinStrip, right? And then you have this one system that is a little bit odd, right? So if you don't know, this is how Microsoft names their standard host names from default installs, is like win, hyphen, or tax something, right? So if you see that in like someone's environment or your own environment, and you have a naming standard, that's something that should probably trigger you a little bit. You can also see that Regis and Fred Biscuit here are logging in from the same exact IP address, sometimes on the same day, right? So if you were to ask yourself, well, where do these two individuals live? One lives in Georgia, and the other one lives in, Atlanta. I mean, not Atlanta. That's in Georgia. South Carolina, right? And the IP address is registered to Arizona. That could be odd, right? Something to think about there. And just to go back and talk about my earlier point of keyword searches for regular expressions for card data is not always the best method, is because you have exactly what we see here. This is actually an example from the framework point-of-sale malware family where it steals the card data and then it encodes it. So you can see here on the left we have that spool sv.chm file, similar to what you saw in the earlier slide. And here it's encoded. It's a custom alphabet with base64 and XOR encoding. And here's what it looks like decoded. If that actually is someone's credit card, that's not intended. Right? All right. So we have a quick exercise for you guys. But are there any questions before I move on to the exercise where you guys have to solve it yourselves? So that's probably like a good talk to have later, but most of the time they're not logging correctly, or there's different ways to get those logs. What you really ideally want to have is a SQL database that's storing all the information, but it's actually stored on the Citrix servers themselves. But sometimes they're Linux, sometimes they're Windows. Yeah, so most of the time the point-of-sale systems are Windows XP embedded. There's some Windows 7 point-of-sale, like they have special point-of-sale like Microsoft does. We see custom-built applications like in Linux. We have yet, to my knowledge, have worked one of those with a custom-built image. But good question. All right. So we're looking at a system, and we're trying to find badness, right? We don't know the time. We don't know anything about it, so we're doing our sniper forensics just like we did today. Unfortunately, Prefetch is disabled. And again, if you didn't see it, Prefetch is disabled by default on servers and systems with solid-state drives. So this is probably a server. Unfortunately, process auditing is enabled, so they'll help you guys out even more. So the goal here is, do you see any files that are a bit odd or? So remember when we look, this is from a shim cache entry right here, these on the left-hand side here, is you're going to see things that have been run on the system, right? You don't know who did it. You don't really know the time that they executed. The goal here is really to find one that kind of sticks out and just doesn't make sense to you. Some things that I like to do is look at my own computer and see if I have it, right? Or if you're looking at the image, does that file exist on the image? If it's that odd, pull it off and do some analysis, which should be careful with, right?
That is the setup from the temp
So-
forwards. That's a little odd. See, zip folder.dl.
Anybody have their computer out? No. So if we ignored, you probably have change.exe.
I just Googled that and I found it as a thing.
Yeah. You probably don't have that top one. That's fine. You probably have WVT util. You definitely have services. You probably don't have rotate logs, right? Another thing that you might want to do is, if you're working for yourself or for a customer, is ask them for a standard image from one of their builds if they have it. And you can also use that as a comparison as well to find out what's abnormal. But the key takeaway here is actually this file called WinHost. It looks really good, but it doesn't belong. Right? So if you Googled WinHost, you probably wouldn't find too much about it. If you're doing some of your research, if you looked at your own computer, you definitely shouldn't have it. If you do have it, you probably have problems. But, right? So it's not easy to find it, but if you were doing some of these analysis steps, you would probably spot it out. So again, using auto runs, again, I'm using the GUI application here to sort of help me out. We can see that WinHost is actually set up down here at the bottom as a service. Well, the service thing's gone, but it's a service. Just take my word for it. But it says file not found, right? So that can mean a couple of different things, but I know it's a service. And so I can look at the event logs, right, for a 7045 event to get my time of when it started to help my timeline analysis. But I can also look in the registry where services are stored to see when that was created as well. So if I do that, what I see here is that there is WinHost in there. It has a date modified time of somewhere in 2015, right? That's probably the most likely time it originated on the system, right? And one thing, why this, when we go back one, when you look at WinHost and it says file not found, that's actually because of how autoruns is sort of programmed. But if you look up here in WoW64 value and it says 1, that's because it's in the syswow64 path. So that's why autorun says it can't find it, even though it does exist on the system because it's in the WoW64 folder. Oh, so you even put that on there. Oh, no, cheating. So again, going back to our system event logs, this is hoping that they haven't been cleaned or wiped. You can see here the 7045 event ID, service was installed. Here's the service path and the service file name and every time that it started. Right, so we got a pretty good idea. We know the time that it got on there. We know how many times it's ran. We don't know how it got on there. So luckily for us, the process outing logs are enabled. Right, so let's sort of use this a little bit. And I know I didn't go into depth about process outing, but it's relatively easy to follow, right? So we can see the login ID, right, which is the 3E7, the account name, the process ID, which is services, right? So make sure your login IDs, you track those as one logon. So you can see services is starting WinHost. So it's definitely a service is what we're seeing here, right? Well, again, how did WinHost get on the box, right? I think that's my malicious service. We need to do a little bit more digging. So I actually cut out one of these slides to make it a little easier. Log the timeline, or Plaso would do this for you, or Xways, right, to build this timeline. So you can see here the account logged on. It's called ITadmin1. It's an administrator account. The LogMeIn process is started. If you can't see the C program files, LogMeIn, right? Command.exe is quickly started after that. We also have wscript, netsh, and then all of a sudden down here at the bottom right is the ITadmin1 app-data roaming update.exe. That's also a little bit odd, right? Update.exe and the app-data roaming file is a bit strange. Any executables in there you should probably examine. All right. So again, following like the process ID, we have 16BC here, if you wanted to follow that around. So you can see that update.exe then starts SVC host, right, which is also weird. And then all of a sudden a new service gets created, WinHost starts, right, which WinHost then starts another instance of SVC host. What's really happening there is what we call code injection. The WinHost process is actually injecting some of its code into that process. So you can sort of follow this all the way down and see how it got on there. The point of this timeline is we can pinpoint it back to the update.exe file, which came from a LogMeIn. So that tells me I need to go look at the LogMeIn logs. So if I go find the LogMeIn logs, which are local to that host, or sometimes there may be a central repository within that environment, looking at that time, 2015, I can see that this 122 IP, which belongs to somewhere, it says IP vanish from Russia, logged in right before the update.exe file process was created. Right? So if this system's located in California and their IT staff is also local, someone logging in from Russia is probably not a good sign. Right? Makes sense. So what I did down here in the bottom right is I actually used grep to parse out all the LogMeIn logs, and I created a pivot table to kind of put all the IPs in one space to figure out which one's like an oddity to me. It didn't help out too much. To be quite honest, the 122 had the most connections, which was they were logging in a lot. So from that whole investigation, we went from system access via LogMeIn, malware was created and executed on the system, installed as a service, existed on there for over a year, technically for this one. And it continues to run until someone finds it. All right, so we solved it in like 5 minutes, right? So that's sort of like the end. I think I'm right on time there. So I just want to open it up to see, yeah, a little 1 minute over. If there's any questions, comments, concerns? No? Was that at least like educational? Did we learn anything? Yeah? Yes, back here. Oh, good, okay. So, all right, if you guys want the slides, just let me know. I'm not going to get them to you till Monday, to be honest.
Get the request for investigation from the vendor, or to get it from the case administrator?
No. So the question was, who do we get requests from for doing the investigations? And that's a great question. So again, when we talked that they have a contract with the card brands, well, the card brands force the retailer to do the investigation. So the retailer pays for the investigations, but we report to the card brands. So it's, before you get into business taking cards, make sure you review those contracts. So if you're like, no worries. Thanks, everybody.
Have you ever worked on an ATM?
Yeah, we've done a couple ATM ones, but they're very different. Most of them are Windows systems, but the malware operates a little bit differently. I think Manning just put out a post on it, like a new variant they just had. I think.
If you don't mind the question, how so are they different?
They generally have like commands from like a central system to spit out money at a certain time. So it's not necessarily looking for card data. They're more of like spitting out money versus looking for card data. In my experience, that's not always the case. So like they have, what do they call them? Like mules, money mules that will spit out. Anyone read the report? It came out last year on like Carbonac. Kaspersky put it out. So Carbonac was a pretty big incident where they were in a bunch of different banks, and they basically at a certain time they would have the money mules go to all the ATMs. And they'd tell the malware to go spit out all the money at the ATMs. So then they'd get all the money. If you haven't read it, it's from I think 2016. It's called Carbonac APT. Just Google it. It's like one of the top links in there. But I have to go now.